All right, and so we're going to do a mindfulness of breathing meditation this evening. So I like to begin by rocking the body from side to side and from front to back. Be moving the head as well. Just loosening up any tendency to lean toward the screen. Loosening up any tension. And feeling the weight of the body on your seat. Releasing the belly and really allowing the body to settle right here in this place. And from that steady base, allowing the spine to come into alignment as best you can, moving into an upright posture. Feeling that alignment all the way up through the neck and the head. And perhaps knowing that the bones are carrying the weight of the body can allow the muscles of the chest and the abdomen to just soften and widen. Gathering the hands together in your lap, right hand over the left hand, and the thumb tips touching. As a way of gathering the energy together. And perhaps at this point, observing the breath, breathing the body. And just allowing the mind to rest on those sensations of the breath. And especially noticing the pauses between the breaths. No need to lengthen them or change them in any way. Just staying present for the pauses between the breaths. Just noticing those natural moments of stillness between the in-breaths and the out-breaths. And perhaps by noticing the pauses between the breaths, you also begin to notice the start of each part of the breath. Those moments where there's a shift from stillness into movement. If you begin to feel tension or try to control the breath, then you can move the attention down to the lower abdomen and observe the echo of the breath, the movement below the breath. Staying curious about the sensations of the breath. And in these last few moments of the meditation, just checking in to see if there's any pleasant feeling associated with the breath. Or perhaps the breath feels very neutral or even unpleasant. Just checking in on the feeling. All right, that was the meditation for this evening. And please double check to make sure that your mics are muted. And I will begin with the homage to the Buddha and the triple gem. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Sometimes it's good to hear a different voice, a different style of saying something similar. And it just lands a different way. Maybe we get a slightly different feeling about it, or we have a different understanding open up. And so this evening I brought a teaching from a teacher that I don't often share about, but one that is offering a teaching that I think is quite important for us. And this is Venerable Hongshe. Hongshe. That is the pronunciation, I believe, the proper pronunciation of his name. Venerable Hongshe was a monk in China a long time ago. I won't say a whole lot about his life, but he lived in the late 11th century in Shanzhou province, and his name Hongzhi was actually given to him after his death by the emperor. It means vast wisdom. It was a kind of honorific name that was given to him, and he was known to be quite intelligent. He had memorized a lot of teachings, and he's mostly well known actually for being the person who gave some verse commentaries on what's known as the Book of Serenity. The Book of Serenity. And the Book of Serenity is a primary collection of koans, of, you could say, brief teaching stories of the Soto Zen school. And there are 100 of them. And in this particular text. And I always thought it was a very ironic name, the Book of Serenity, actually, because a lot of people don't find koan practice particularly peaceful. It can be a little bit like a confusing. The koans can be a bit confusing or a bit confounding. But what I wanted to share with you was what the commentator here who compiled this, who's this? This is Cleary, I believe, Thomas Cleary, said he's also known as Tian Tong, Hongshe Tian Tong, same person. And he is known as the crowning master of the restoration of the house of Soto Zen in China, which had literally perished, like the whole lineage had gone out, had been extinguished 2 generations before him. And then the Linji, the so-called Rinzai school, they held on to it for 1 generation until the next time. So don't worry about getting all these names perfectly straight. It's more the story of this person who became someone who picked up the teaching of this school, which had gone out, like the passing of the torch had gone out. And then he started it again. And this is from a translation of a short text that he wrote. And this translation was done by my good friend Taigen Layton, who has a lovely sangha up in Chicago. And so if you're ever up there, you could talk to Taigen about his translations of this material. And so I just want to share this it's a very brief 1-paragraph teaching. So now comes the part, Claudia, that I gave you. So the easier part. Thank you for slogging through that other part. So this is a 1-paragraph teaching called Beaming Through All the Gloom. And that's just the title that's pulled out of, it's just a piece of what's written there. It's not a title that he gave it. But he begins this way. He says, study the Buddha and research his lineage's subtlety. So I couldn't agree more. All the schools of Buddhism emerged from the teachings of the Buddha, and they may have discovered other ways of working with that material, but we all benefit from those teachings. So he says, study the Buddha and research his lineage's subtlety. So right away, he's pointing to something subtle that we are going to investigate here. And he says, very kindly, in this teaching, he sounds like, to me, like a very kindly old person. You must clarify your heart. Dive into the spirit. So he's going to tell us in a few moments what he means by clarify the heart. So I won't say anything about that right now. But I do want to say this part about the spirit. So oftentimes this gets confused. Dive into the spirit. It doesn't mean the spirit like the Holy Spirit, like some essential thing that is within you. It means like the team spirit. Like get on with the program, get on board with the program. That's really what it means. It means to actually dive into what the practice asks you to do, to give yourself over to the practice. So dive into the spirit and silently wander in contemplation. Silently wander in contemplation. A very simple request, something that we can all do. Yeah? Just go for a quiet walk. Just go for a quiet walk. And it reminds me, that particular piece reminds me of a teaching from the Dhammapada, speaking of the Buddha. And so the Dhammapada is a very beloved, you could say, collection of verses, very short verses that are given by the historical Buddha, so 1500 or so years before Master Hengsher's teaching. And there's a section in there called Happiness, in the Dhammapada, and it says, so happily we live without hate among those who hate. Among people who hate, we live without hate. So happily we walk without misery among those in misery. Among people in misery, we live without misery. And he goes on in that vein. So it's not talking about indifference to others. It's talking about an inner equanimity, a way of being in the world which is steadied, even in the face of hatred or difficulty, misery, suffering. And I believe that we'll see that Venerable Hengsher is also teaching us something about that. So he says, as we silently wander in contemplation, we are understanding the Dharma's source. So again, to be very careful with this word source, it doesn't mean some eternal thing that is bringing forth what we see in front of us. That would be contrary to the teachings. We could say the Dharma source that we're understanding is the arising and passing of things arising and ceasing because of their interdependence. This is what we can see when we go for a quiet walk. We can see things happening, beginning, ending, our breath, things around us. And again, sounding like a very sweet old person, he says, without pettiness, so without nitpicking, like really, really setting aside a certain kind of discrimination, without pettiness, or without weaving hairs to create an obstacle. This is a funny turn of phrase, weaving hairs. It means something like, so, when we talk about there's a colloquial phrase in English, you talk about splitting hairs, like when you're, getting too deep into the details in a way that's divisive or that creates conflict. Talk about splitting hairs. So he's talking here about weaving hairs to create an obstacle, like a similar thing. Getting way down into the details in a way that increases the conflict, increases the sense of separation. So he says, without those things, be generous beyond appearances. Meet all people where they are. That's what the beyond appearances means. Meet all things and all people where they are. Don't be caught up in the superficial appearances, but really meet in a which way? In a generous way. In a generous way. And that reminds me also of a quote. So I'm just, as you can see, I have sort of woven together all sorts of pieces here, which will hopefully make sense in the end. And this is a quote from Venerable Nyanananda. Venerable Nyanananda, he is a monk in Thailand, or was actually, I think he's passed now. And he gave a series of teachings on nirvana or nibbana. And he said this. He said, though we say that we attain nibbana or obtain nibbana, there is nothing to gain and nothing to lose. If anything, what is lost is an ignorance that there is something and a craving that there is not enough. So do you hear that piece at the end? This craving that there is not enough is something that goes away when the Dhamma is really fully penetrated. That's where the generosity comes from. The generosity comes from the understanding of the abundance of all conditions that are before us. So splendid and beautifully shining like the waters in autumn. He now gets poetic on us. He says, noble like the moon. He's speaking about us as practitioners. When we take up this practice, what are we? We are noble beings. Yeah? Just as the Buddha said, this path is about helping us become noble, but in the process of becoming noble, we are actually demonstrating it. We are taking up those noble, dignified choices, by living an ethical life or by really being wise about how we are with others. So noble, like the moon. So the moon, of course, is a very classical metaphor for wisdom. The moon shining, overwhelming the darkness. So the shining wisdom. And again, this overwhelming the darkness, I wonder if this is a reference to the early suttas in which it said that the arahantas and the arahantis, the male and the female enlightened ones, would speak about splitting open the darkness. That's what it felt like to wake up, to split open the darkness. So here he is talking about wisdom overwhelming the darkness. And then he gives us some advice. He says, from the beginning, whatever beginning point you choose, from the beginning, just beam through all gloom, profoundly free from stains. So let's talk about the stains part. So the stains, this is definitely a reference to the early Buddhist teachings. Stains is a way that we translate this word kilesa. Kilesa, it's a Pali word. And it's usually translated as stains or hindrances, or also the kilesa. Yes, that's one way. Sometimes there's this very harsh word that I don't like to use too much, but sometimes you see them also called the defilements. So these are the stain, and there are said to be 10 of them. Our favorite characters: greed, hatred, and delusion. By favorite, I don't mean like the ones we like, but actually the ones that get most often mentioned are greed, hatred, and delusion, arrogance, wrong view, doubt, stubbornness, restlessness, and shamelessness, like being shameless, not having good judgment, or recklessness, also not having good judgment. So these are the kinds of things that he's talking about. So being free from those things. But what I want to go back to is how, and that's the just beam through the gloom part. So first of all, this is interesting to me because I think Venerable Hongshu, there's acknowledging that there is gloominess, that there can be a darkness or a sadness or a gloominess that we experience as part of our lives. Yeah? So this is one way of talking about dukkha, talking about that word. It's often translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. And yet there is this ability to shine through that gloom, to shine through that gloom. And the hint that I will give you about that, or the way that we might think about that, even before there's any kind of vast or penetrative insight, one way to think about that is just our attention, our wise, frequent attention to what we see in our lives is what makes the difference. And so as an example, I would say, if you're feeling sad about something and you're not really attending to that sadness, or you're trying to push it down, or you're trying to ignore it, or you try to different ways of coping with it without paying attention, then oftentimes what happens is that sadness can really linger. It can come back again and again. But if you pay attention wisely, and so an example of that would be the thought, oh, I see this feeling of sadness is here. I feel this feeling of sadness is present right now. Yeah. Not I'm a sad person. You see how there's a difference there of becoming identified with the thing. That's what I'm a sad person is identifying with the feeling, versus actually observing with clarity and attention and being able to sort of perceive that thing, understand that acknowledge the presence of the phenomena. Yes, sadness is here. There's sadness here in this moment. So this is one way to think about shining. So what is the shining? The shining is the attention. Ajahn Brahm is this very well-known, funny British man who lives in Australia, in a monastery in Australia. He's very well known for having supported the women's ordination process. And he talks about your attention as being like your flashlight. When you get really good at meditation, at pointing your attention different places, you have a stronger flashlight. So it's like this. Hongshu is speaking to us about shining through the gloom, attending with this wise attention. And when that's possible, then there is that freedom from the stain. It's not that the stain might not be there. The stain might, in fact, still be there. But we're not confused by it. We're not identified by it. We allow that state of ignorance or delusion or restlessness to just be acknowledged, and to have its time be there when it's there and gone when it's gone. And then he says a little bit more about what that experience can be like. He says, constantly still and constantly glorious. So now I believe that we see where he's going with this, because again, the free from stain, if we look at what the Pali word for that might be, and he didn't write in Pali, obviously, he wrote in Chinese. But if we look at what the Pali word might be for that, that would be virajan padan. It would be a word that means the stainless element, the element that is without stain. And what is the stainless element? That is a synonym for nirvana or nibbana. So I'm wondering now, as we go along, we see that perhaps he's starting to have these subtle references to nibbana, because that is what the only thing that is constantly still is nirvana, the state of the unconditioned. So because conditioned things are always arising and ceasing, that is their nature. And despite the fact that we might not be around to see either one of the two ends of that, that is generally true. But the stillness, and then he says this, the stillness is not ended or put out by the causes, by the conditions that create the arising and ceasing. Oh, so that's interesting. So he's saying that stillness and movement or arising can happen at the same time. And so how is that possible? How is that possible? Because this is the way that we need to understand nirvana, as not something that is far away in some other time or some other place or some perfect version of you, but rather that nirvana is here, accessible in this moment. That is how people wake up. It's not by creating a thing called nirvana, it is by accessing the thing called nirvana, which is here. So the example that I want to give is a story that I've told a few times, and it dates from my period of training in Japan. So I spent the better part of 2 years in Japan after my ordination with my master, Seke Harada Roshi, in 2007. And it was summertime, and we were having this meeting. We were having to have a meeting. It was going to all happen in Japanese. Mind you that I don't speak enough. I barely speak enough Japanese to have somebody help me find the bathroom. Okay, so this meeting was going to be a really long, boring event, and it's in this room, this tiny little room, 20 of us all seated in this tiny little room with this hot fluorescent lighting above us. And so there we were, and the meeting, they're talking at the front of the room. And for those of you who are familiar with the Peanuts movies, so the movies that were made about Snoopy and Charlie Brown, and then the teacher at the front of the room goes, "Bwah, bwah, 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 bwah." They just make a sound and there's no words. And it was kind of like that. The folks who were running the meeting, to me, it was just like that, like blah, blah, just sounds and no words. And it was really hot. It's summertime, very, very hot and very, very sticky and humid. And so we each had these fans. We had been given these little round fans. And the fans were blue, and they had blue on both sides, and they had these little dots on them and a little white plastic handle. And the first time I looked at the fan, I looked at it and I thought, oh, it has this like random, it's just random dots. It's not like a discernible pattern or like the dots that would look attractive. It just seemed like a random thing. But then earlier that evening, when I had picked up the fan to go to the meeting, I noticed, oh, these dots are actually a drawing of the night sky. And I thought, oh, how funny is that, right? Like instead of actually going and sitting outside where it's cooler under the night sky, we're going to use this picture of a night sky to try to cool ourselves off. That's classic human concepts. But there we were, and we were sitting there, and it's really hot, and the people are talking, and I was I wasn't even fanning myself at that point. I had just given up. I was just melting. But my friend next to me, who was a good friend and had been a farmer before he was a monk, very sweet man, was fanning. And as he was fanning, he flicked his fan and then the whole thing turned white. That part of the fan that had been blue with the little dots of the night sky, it just all went poof, and it turned white very suddenly. And it totally caught my eye. It just struck me. And then he flicked it again. And then there was, the blue of the fan and the little dots of the night sky, the idea of night sky. And then he flicked it again, and then poof, again, the whole fan was white. And so now, he wasn't doing anything special, my friend. It's not like he was doing a special way of fanning the fan, or there wasn't anything special about the lights in the room, and there wasn't anything special about the fan itself. There's not a light inside the fan. But what happened there was that for a moment, I saw the luminosity of the fan, which had always been there, that luminous quality of the fan, except that I hadn't seen it until that moment when the conditions were just right, and he flicks the fan, and the whole thing shifts. Do you see? So this principle of the luminosity of the fan was there, but I wasn't able to see it until certain conditions came into play. But even during that luminous time, right, the blue fan is still there. Blue fan with white dots is still there. It's just that I can't see it. I can only see one phenomena or the other. And in the same way, when we see nirvana, you can only see nirvana, which is the unconditioned, or you can see the other side. You can see the conditioned side. And we live in the conditioned side. That's what we normally see. That's why you cannot conceive of nirvana. You cannot really have you can have an idea of it, but it will never be what your idea is. So this is something for us to explore, to begin to consider, just at a very, very simple level. Observing the conditioned, by observing the conditioned, we become capable of observing nirvana, the unconditioned. So he goes on, he says, it's vacant or sort of empty, round and pure. It does not shake, it does not shift. That is nibbana, that is a description of nibbana. Everything else, again, all the conditioned world, everything that you experience is not like that. It is moving, shifting. It is moving and shifting so much that it's all basically a process rather than a thing. So then, able to be serene and able to know this, you can walk securely. And the Buddha himself said that nibbana is the only true security. So perhaps just knowing it even conceptually helps you to walk a little more securely, to actually attend to your life in a different way. And then as the path progresses, you can experience that. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail here, but I do want to say this. He says, in this realm that we're in, are the separate limited forms. That is what we're seeing, right? We are seeing independent things that are nonetheless related to one another. But all are only what the self establishes, arising along with our own bodies. So this sense of separation and this sense of limitation is built upon the way that we observe the world. So this is why we need to investigate. This is why we need to really steady ourselves and silently wander in contemplation, as Hong Sure says, so that we might understand the role that our perception is playing in missing that pure white luminous quality of nibbana. How could there be any obstruction? So that is his parting. Well, actually, there's a little bit more to the paragraph, but I would say that is his parting question to us. We live in the midst of this reality. However you conceive this reality, we live in one single reality, all of us. So how could we be obstructed in any way from understanding reality? We are integral to that thing. It can't be far away from you. It's right here on your walk. Thank you.